Now, we're in a series that we're calling Living the Dream. And we started the series last weekend. And last week, I talked to everybody that was in here and reminded you that if you are a Christian, God has a dream for your life. God has a calling for your life. And what that simply means is this: God has something for you to do with your life that only you can do. I can't fulfill your dream for you. Nobody else can fulfill your dream. Only you can fulfill the dream that God has for your life, the destiny that he has for your life. We also learn that most people never experience that. Most of us, we have the dream, so we're living with the dream, but we don't actually experience the dream. We don't find ourselves living in the dream. And then we discovered that by looking at the life of Joseph, there's a journey that God is going to take us on if we're going to experience life as he planned for us to experience. If we're going to experience the purpose, the unique purpose that he designed us for. And for us to get there to where we're living that life, we're learning that God is going to take us through a whole bunch of tests. And we have to pass these tests. And as I said last week, we don't really fail these tests. We just get a retake. And if you feel like you keep going through the same test in your life, the reality is you probably haven't learned from that test what you need to learn. And so God's going to keep giving it to you because that's how gracious he is. But there's a reason that we go through these tests, and you could sum it up in one word, and the word is character. In other words, God is building our character throughout our lives to support the dream or the destiny that he has for us. In fact, I gave a principle last weekend. Your dream and your destiny will never be larger than what your character can support. So if you want to live the dream that God has for you, not just live with it, but actually live in that dream, you're going to have to pass these tests. So we began to look at this study in the life of Joseph. And last week we looked at the pride test. If you weren't here, if you haven't downloaded the app, get the Be Renewed app. I know that it's going up on the App Store on Apple this week. So that will be available, but there is a QR code if you want to just go ahead and download it. All the sermon notes from this weekend are on the app. The videos from the previous week are on the app. They usually go up about Monday after Sunday. And so go back and listen to it, or you can go to the YouTube channel and you can check out last week. We talked about the fact that God is going to have to deal with our pride. If we're going to experience our dream, because at some point we have to quit chasing our dream and we have to start chasing the dream that God has for us. And usually that means we have to set our pride out of the way. This weekend, we're going to talk about the pit test. What does it mean to be in a pit? And how do you get out of the pit? And some of you would describe life as the pits, right? And so maybe you're in a pit this weekend. We're going to talk about why God puts us in the pit, what we need to learn from the pit, and how do we get out of the pit? So we're going to talk about that. So if you brought a Bible this morning, Genesis chapter 37, we'll stay there most of the time. If you brought your app, the notes are there. Genesis chapter 37, we're going to pick up the story in verse 13, and it begins by saying, and Israel. And I pointed out last week that Jacob is the father of Joseph. He's the father of this family. God changed Jacob's name to Israel, and those names are used interchangeably throughout the story of Joseph. I often wonder why people say the Bible's just too complicated. Sometimes I think God went out of his way to make it complicated. I mean, you can't just change a guy's name right in the middle, right? But when you read Israel, think you're really reading about Jacob. And so Israel, who's also Jacob, said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them. Very well, he replied. Verse 14, so he said to him, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me. So basically, Jacob wants to know, how are the boys doing? Go check on them. By the way, I think part of the reason that Jacob did this is he knew there was incredible tension between Joseph and the brothers. We talked about that last week. They hated him. And they hated him because of his pride. They hated him because of that coat that he likes to show off and how he used to brag about, they were going to bow down to him one day. They hated him. I think Jacob was constantly thinking, how can I get these boys together so maybe they can work through things? So he sends them out to check on them. And then he says, then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields. And I think it's interesting. It doesn't say that Joseph saw this guy and went up to him and said, hey, have you seen my brothers? No, it just says this guy finds Joseph wandering around in a field. Now, last week we talked about the fact that Joseph was a dreamer, okay? You know what I'm thinking? He was also a daydreamer. Instead of finding his brothers, he's out just wandering around in the field, and he's looking up at the clouds and watching the birds and admiring all the flowers, right? And this guy walks up to him and said, hey, look what it says, verse 15. What are you looking for? He replied, I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks? They have moved on from here, the man answered. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. That's in Alabama. It's quite a ways to go from where they were to graze the flocks, but somehow they got to Alabama. Verse 18, they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. So they see him off in the distance, and they start thinking, we got to get rid of this guy, and this could be our chance. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him to one of the cisterns. What's the cistern? It's a pit. Some of you went to Israel with me last year. We'll be going again in November if you'd like to go. There's a dinner at Enrico's tonight. I'll give a little, 6 o'clock. It's free if you're interested, like to get some information on that trip for November. But a cistern was a pit that was driven out, that was dug out of limestone, and basically it captured water during the rainy season. So in this dry, barren desert land, they would have water to drink. In this case, there is no water in the cistern, so it's dry. So let's throw him to one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Now, I've talked about my whole life when I taught the story of Joseph. I saw something when I was preparing this week I'd never seen before. I always said that they took the robe of Joseph, they put blood all over it, they took it back to Dad and said, look, a wild animal killed him. Now, what I discovered this week is they said, this is what we're going to tell Dad. We'll tell Dad that a ferocious animal devoured him, tore him up. We'll see in a minute whether they actually told him that or not, okay? Verse 21, when Reuben, and Reuben is the oldest, when he heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness. Don't lay a hand on him. Now, notice this. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and to take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing. Verse 24, they took him and they threw him into the cistern. Okay, they threw him into the pit. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. By the way, this kind of reminds me of a story. It's a true story. There was a guy that worked second shift in a little town in the South, and he didn't get off to midnight every night, and he lived close to home, so he always walked to work and walked home. And he found out there was a shortcut he could take through the cemetery. And so he was walking through the cemetery, and it's one of those dark nights. It's cloudy. There's no moon. And he didn't realize, but the grave diggers, they had dug a grave. And he walked and fell right into the grave. And he falls in this grave, and he's screaming. Nobody hears him. He's jumping up. He's clawing. He's getting grass, dirt, rocks, nothing. And finally he realizes, I'm not getting out of this grave until tomorrow when someone shows up and they can help me. Well, he just plops down in the back corner of the grave. About an hour later, true story, a drunk comes stumbling through the cemetery, and he falls in the same grave. And he starts doing screaming and yelling. And he comes jumping and he's clawing. He cannot get out of the pit. And finally, he just plopped down. He didn't realize the other guy was in the pit. And the guy that was in the pit first reached up and touched him on the shoulder and said, you can't get out. But he did. And I tell you that because here's my story. You can get out of a pit if you're properly motivated, okay? And this guy was properly motivated. So we're going to talk about the pit and how do you get out of the pit. By the way, just because that wasn't enough, I'm going to give you one more corny joke. The drunk then went home the next day when he got out of the pit. They finally got out of the pit, and he told his wife what had happened. And his wife said, I have just had it with you being a drunk, right? I got to come up with something. So she decided she was going to scare the drinking out of her husband. So she went to the Halloween store, and she bought a Satan outfit. A little red outfit, red horns, a little red tail, a little red pitchfork. And she thought, tonight I'm going to hide in the bushes by the front porch, and when he comes stumbling up, I'm going to scare the drinking out of him. So sure enough, he come walking up the sideline about midnight, and she's hiding behind the bushes, and she jumped down and said, ha, I'm Satan. He said, put her there. I married your sister. But anyway, none of that has to do with the Joseph story, okay? Okay, so we find ourselves in the pit. How are we going to get out of the pit? I'm going to give you 3 words, and hopefully you'll be able to remember this way. 3 words that begin with P. Here's the first word, position. Position. And there's a question you have to ask yourself. What got me in this pit? Now, I don't know what kind of pit you may be in this weekend. You may be in a financial pit. I have heard more stories this week about the amount of money that people had to write checks for to pay their taxes, right? And I've heard some sad stories. Maybe you find yourself in a financial pit. But this is what's interesting about the pit as we go through this. Sometimes you put yourself in the pit. Sometimes, even with the life of Joseph, you had nothing to do with it. But regardless, you're in the pit. Maybe it's financial. Maybe you're in a family pit. Maybe your family is just in disarray right now and you're not sure what to do about it. Maybe you're in a marriage pit. Maybe you're in a relational pit. Maybe when it comes to God, it's just been so dry. You're just in a spiritual pit. By the way, I say that because it says in the story, there was no water in the pit. And maybe that describes your life as you sit here this morning. Maybe you feel like you're just in this barren, dry place. It's an unproductive time of life, maybe even like a desert. If you want to do an interesting study in the Bible, study all the different desert experiences in the Bible and why God brought these desert experiences into people's life. But maybe that describes your life this weekend. You got to ask yourself the question, how did I get in the pit? What got you in the pit? And I'm not encouraging you to do that so that you have to beat yourself up or feel guilty about how you got in the pit or even condemn yourself. I'm thinking more about the way David handled it when he was in the pit. This is what it says in Psalm 139, verse 23. This is what David wrote. Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me. The Hebrew word translated offensive, other places is translated wicked. God, while I'm in this pit, check me out. Help me do a survey of my life. Let me see if there's any wicked. In other words, did I do anything that put myself into this situation? Now, I'm not sure that Joseph, that was his response to being in the pit. I'm guessing as I read through the story, he is human. I'm guessing that he basically blamed his brothers for the situation. He probably, did the same thing that we would have done. I mean, if my brother threw me in the pit, my sister threw me in the pit, my family threw me in the pit, I'm probably going to blame my family for putting me in the pit. And so he's probably thinking, it's not my fault I'm in the pit. I didn't do anything wrong. I don't deserve this. The only reason I'm in the pit because my brothers, they know that Dad loves me more than he loves them. This is on them. This isn't my problem. And I'm guessing that that's probably the way that Joseph processed this pit experience. And we know from last week that because of pride, Joseph brought some of these tests on himself. But we're going to see in the next few weeks, a lot of these tests Joseph didn't bring on himself. And he passed those tests with flying colors. This is what I think about the pit test. I think Joseph passed it, but I don't think he passed it with flying colors. Let me just go back and show you a verse. Genesis 37, verse 18. It's kind of interesting here. They saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. In other words, Joseph was far enough away that they actually had time to think about this. They had time to put together a plan based on a conversation. Now, how is it that they saw him so far off? It's because he's wearing that dang coat. You know what I think? I think Joseph wore that coat everywhere he went, probably every day. He would have worn it in August in Fuquay, okay? It didn't matter to him. Doesn't matter. And so this is why they saw him so far. He's wearing the coat, right? I mean, think about it. It's orange and purple and pink and blue and green and red, and it's probably bedazzled. It's probably glowing in the sun, right? So they spot him out, and they start thinking, he's got to go. We got to do something with this guy. By the way, let me just say this, because you're going to see this several times today, but especially as we go through this series. Whenever you study the Bible, especially when you're studying the Old Testament, look for analogies. Look for similes, because often you will see something in the Old Testament that gives us an idea of what's going to happen in the New Testament. I'll give you an example. When Adam and Eve sinned in the Garden of Eden and they covered themselves up with fig leaves, did you ever wonder why God said, I'm going to kill an animal and skin it and cover you up with their skin? It was kind of like going to the movie and seeing a preview of a coming attraction. You know what God was saying in Genesis? For mankind, their sin to be covered up, blood is going to have to be shed. Something's going to have to die. So there are analogies like this all through the Old Testament, and you really, really see them. A lot of people believe that Joseph in many ways represents, and I'll point some of these out this weekend, represents Jesus Christ later in the New Testament. But there's a couple of things I want to show you. First of all, I want you to remember that Joseph was his father's favored son. Now, I want you to think about this. I don't know if you've ever thought about it this way or not, but if you are a child of God, you are your father's favorite son. You are your father's favored daughter. And why do I say that? Because the word favor literally means grace. That's what it means. And so as his child, God's grace is on you. As his child, he puts his favor on you. As his child, he favors you. So that's one analogy. Another one is Joseph's father gave him a gift. What was the gift? It was a robe, right? You can say it. Let's say it out loud together. It was a robe. See how easy that was? Now, maybe you've never thought about it this way, but when you became a child of God, he gave you a gift. He may have given you several gifts because he gave you at the time of salvation spiritual gifts. And these are gifts that God gave us. Maybe you have the gift of encouragement. Maybe you have the gift of giving. Maybe you have the gift of helps. There's all kinds of different gifts. The gift of prophecy. There's kind of different gifts. But God gave you a gift. Now, here was Joseph's problem in the story. Remember we saw last week that he was proud of his gift, and he showed it off every chance he got. In fact, he flaunted his gift so much, that's why his brothers hated him. In the same way, I've learned over the years, a lot of Christians, they don't really use their spiritual gifts, but they're proud of their spiritual gifts. They love to brag about, I got the gift of giving. I don't give anything, but I got the gift, Or I've got the gift of mercy. Or I've got the gift of help. I'll never help anybody, but I got the gifts of help. See, you don't do anything with your gifts, but you like to talk about it and you like to show them off. But understand, God gave you your gifts for one very specific reason. He gave you your gifts to encourage one another in the body. And I think it's interesting, Joseph showed his gift off all the time. And guess what? He ended up losing his gift. And I know what some of you are thinking, wait a second, Mike, I read a verse somewhere that says the gifts are irrevocable. So no matter what you do, God's not going to take your spiritual gift away. Well, let me just tell you, you read it in Romans chapter 11. That's where it says God's gifts are irrevocable. But I would encourage you to go back and read Romans chapter 11 because it has nothing to do with spiritual gifts. It's talking about the nation of Israel. But that's not even my point. I think that even though Joseph had the gift taken away, I think that God restored him. I mean, have you ever read the book of Job? He lost everything. Everything. Livestock, health, children, 10 of them. But if you go to chapter 42, God restored everything twofold, except his children. He only gave him back 10. See, that's called grace right there. He didn't give him 20. He only gave him 10. I think in the same way that God restored Joseph. For example, by becoming prime minister, Joseph pretty much would have been the second wealthiest man on the planet at that time after Pharaoh. So I'm guessing that eventually he may have lost one robe, but I'm guessing eventually he had hundreds of robes. He probably had a master closet where you push the button and they just zip by until you pick the one you want for today, right? But not only that, I actually think that maybe, and again, this is where I'm just guessing a little bit, I think that maybe Joseph got his coat back. Because it's interesting, it never tells us what happened to the coat. And I guarantee you this, I bet you his dad Jacob never threw it away. I mean, this was the coat that he had made for his favorite son, right? And I can't prove it, but it's possible that Joseph got that robe back. And maybe one day in the future, he got to hold that robe and see that robe with all of that blood on it. And maybe he looked at that robe and thought, wow, thank you, God. Thank you, God, for giving me that pit experience because you delivered me out of it. And look at what my life has become. I'm just saying it's possible. But I'll tell you, I know for sure what he did get back, and it's more important than the gift. He got back his relationship with the Father. And that may be one of the reasons that you're in a pit today. Maybe you've drifted in your relationship with the Father, and the Father loves you too much. Please, he knows you're never going to live the dream that way. And as we're going to see, maybe the very reason you're in the pit is just to bring you back into that relationship with the Father. But you got to ask yourself, why am I in this position? Here's the second P, perspective. And here's the question you got to ask. What's God's perspective on the pit? Not how you view the experience, but how does God view this experience that you're going through? Now, let me just say something here. I can promise you this. When you're in the pit, if you're in the pit right now, the very first person that's going to come up and try to explain to you why you are in the pit is going to be the enemy. It's going to be Satan. What's the Bible call Satan? The great accuser. And this is what I've learned. Satan will fabricate all kinds of lies to give you the wrong perspective of why you're in the pit. I'll give you an example. You're divorced. God can't use you. He had a dream for your life, but you can kiss that dream goodbye. Now, I want to tell you something. Being divorced doesn't disqualify you. It doesn't disqualify you from experiencing the dream that God has for you. But see, that's the kind of lie that Satan's going to come and tell you when you're in the pit. Don't even bother to get out of the pit. You got no future anyway. By the way, let me ask you this. How can you tell if you're hearing God's voice or the enemy's voice when you're in the pit? It's very simple. If it's condemning, it's Satan. If it's convicting, it's God. Let me say that again. If it's condemning, it's Satan. If it's convicting, it's God. What's the difference between condemning and convicting? Condemnation is general. Conviction from God is very specific. For example, God may say to me, you kind of spoke harshly to Shannon. You need to ask her for forgiveness. That's conviction. Satan would say, did you hear how you spoke to her? You're a bad person. You destroy everything you touch, right? That's the reason you're in the pit. So understand, Satan loves to condemn. Now understand something else. God will never condemn you. If you sense condemnation, it's not coming from God. God never, 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 ever is going to condemn you. Romans chapter 8, verse 1. There is what? No condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. What's the most memorized verse in the Bible? What is it? You know it. What is it? Good. John 3:16. Don't say, I think it's Jesus, but I'll say squirrel. Okay. The most memorized verse in the Bible is John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have what? Eternal life, everlasting life, whatever version you memorize. I wish we would put as much energy memorizing John 3:17. For God so loved the world, he gave his only son, that whosoever believed in him should not perish, but have eternal life. Verse 17. For God sent not his son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. He didn't send his son into the world to condemn us. Why didn't he send his son into the world to condemn us? Hey, people, we were already condemned. We were born condemned. Nobody needed to condemn us. He sent his son, verse 16, to save us. Now, I want to show you how good Satan is at giving you a perspective that's wrong. You can see it right here in the story. That verse 30, chapter 37, verse 31. They got Joseph's robe. They slaughtered a goat. They dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, now watch this. They did not tell Dad that an animal destroyed him. They said they were going to say that. That was their plan. But they didn't say it. Look what I just noticed this week when I was studying. Genesis 37, verse 32. We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe. Can you sense how much they detest Joseph? They can't even use his name. See if it's your son's robe. He, Jacob, recognized it and said, it is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. The brothers didn't tell him that. Jacob saw the robe. He came to that conclusion all by himself. By the way, do you know how long it was before Jacob found out that Joseph was still alive? 22 years. He found out that Joseph was still alive when Joseph was 39. This took place when Joseph was 17, 22 years. I mean, how can you not be ticked off at these brothers? See, I look at this from a father's perspective. For 22 years, they probably heard a lot of nights where Dad was just crying himself to sleep, right? They had watched maybe how he had aged right before their eyes. Just the general sense of sadness that he carried in his soul for all of these years. And not a one of listen, these guys made a pact. They never broke. They never broke it. Not a one of them ever went to Dad one night when he was crying and said, Dad, I got to talk to you. I'm just going to, Dad, it's very, very possible that Joseph is still alive. A wild animal didn't kill him dead. That's not what happened. Let me tell you what happened. That never took place. That never took place. But anyway, get God's perspective on the pit. Here's the third P, purpose. And this is the big one. What's the purpose of the pit? Well, if you look at it from a human perspective, I think one of the reasons was to save Joseph's life. Because think about it, they were going to kill him. And so when you look back, hindsight 2020, the pit, which I'm sure at the time seemed so horrible, actually ended up saving Joseph's life. I mean, yeah, they sold him into slavery, but that's better than dying. After all, God delivered him from slavery. So, but here's the perspective of every pit. Regardless of what pit you're in today, this is the perspective you've got to have. The perspective of every pit is to get us to cry out to God. That's the perspective of the pit. It's to get outside of ourselves and turn to God. I mean, think of it. You're in a pit. Right now, you're in a pit. Who else are you going to cry out to? You're in a pit all by yourself, right? I mean, you can cry out and talk to yourself, but you're probably not going to be very encouraging. So when you're in the pit, if that's where you are today, the answer is cry out to God. I can show you a lot of verses. Let me show you a couple. One's from the life of Jonah. Jonah chapter 2, verse 1. It says, from inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, in my distress, I called out to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead, the Hebrew that's translated here, realm of the dead, is the word Sheol. We looked at it a few weeks on Easter. It literally means pit. So he says, from deep in the pit, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. Verse 6, to the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath me barred me in forever. But you, Lord, my God, brought my life up from the pit. So understand, whenever you find yourself in a pit, and listen, sometimes I feel like I'm in 3 different pits in 1 week, right? Whenever you find yourself in the pit, I want you to understand, you have a choice. You have a choice. You can cry out to God and you can ask the question, God, what are you trying to do in my life? What's the purpose you have for me? What is the lesson you have for me? God, what is it you're trying to teach me? Or you can gripe about all the people that you think are responsible for you being in the pit. Or how unfair it is that you're in the pit. And it may not have even been your fault. I'm not even saying that. I'm just saying, why not speak to God and say, God, what are you trying to do in my life? Because the quicker you solve the test, the quicker that God can move you on to the next one. And he can check that one off. I actually think that when Joseph was in the pit, I think it was the turning point of his life. I think this is when everything began to change, because next week we're going to see a totally different Joseph when we look at the prosperity test. A totally different perspective about everything. I think this is when his life began to change. I think that he probably started out his pit experience the same way that we would have started out this experience if we had been in his situation. It would have probably been like, God, I just want to remind you of the dream you gave me, that I'm going to be somebody. And all these loser brothers, they're supposed to bow down to me. They can't bow down to me while I'm in the pit. And so, God, I know you're going to get them. You get them, you make their life miserable for putting me in this pit. You go sick them, God, right? I'm guessing that's probably how he started. And then after a while of maybe God not really communicating with him, by the way, another great study in the Bible is a study of all the times where God was silent. There are periods that says where God was silent for 40 years. And so I'm guessing he's sitting in the pit and it's quiet and God's not speaking. And maybe Joseph got to the point, okay, God, okay, I am willing to admit I probably had a little bit to do with being in this pit. But God, listen, you know, and I know it both. It's mainly their fault. And then maybe after a couple of hours of not hearing anything from God, he was probably like, oh, God, it's my fault. Please get me out. Whatever it was. But he finally came to realization he was the reason that he was in the pit. And I think at that moment, I think when Joseph got to that point where he learned what he needed to learn, I think it was that moment that the light went on in Judah, the brother, in his mind and said, you know what, guys? Let's don't kill him. Let's pull them out of the pit. Let's just sell them into slavery. Let me just give you a little side stuff here. As I said, there's a lot of analogies in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. Let me show you a couple in this story. First of all, Reuben was the oldest brother. What does the oldest refer to when you're reading through the Bible, especially the Old Testament? What? Firstborn. Firstborn. That makes you the oldest, right? Reuben's the oldest, who said this in Genesis 37, verse 22. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So Reuben is the oldest. He's the firstborn. Okay, who was the firstborn in the New Testament? Jesus. Paul said in Romans chapter 8, verse 29, for those who God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And what did Jesus come to this earth as the firstborn to do? He came to rescue us and to bring us back to the Father, to restore us, to reconcile us back to the Father. That was exactly Reuben's intentions. Also, Joseph is a type of Christ in this story, and I told you you'll see it throughout the story. For Joseph, the brothers took the robe off of him. Jesus had the robe taken off of him. Judas was sold for 20 pieces of silver to the Midianite traders. And then they took him and sold him to Egypt, and you can assume at a profit, and we know from history, at this time in history, the going price for a slave in Egypt was 30 pieces of silver. Who else was sold for 30 pieces of silver? Jesus. Here's one. Judah was the brother who had the idea to betray Jesus and to sell him into slavery. Who betrayed Jesus and sold him out? So we got Judah and we got Judas. You say, now, Mike, you're stretching it. Those are two different names altogether. Well, just so you know, the New Testament is written in Greek. The Old Testament is written in Hebrew. The Old Testament word Judah is Judas in the Greek. What was Mary's name, the mother of Jesus? What was Jesus' mother's name? I gave it to you. Okay, we can all get this one. What was Jesus' mother's name? Mary. No. Her name was Miriam. Her Hebrew name was Miriam. The Greek translation is Mary. You see a lot of these in the New Testament. Story of Joseph and Miriam. That's going to screw up your Christmas. Don't even just take that out of the video, right? When the Midianite traders came, guess what they were carrying? Balm and spices and myrrh. When the followers of Jesus came to the tomb to prepare him for burial, they were bringing balm and spices and myrrh. A lot of similarities throughout the story, but here, this is what I want to leave you with this weekend. If you're in a pit this weekend, I know for a fact that God's going to bring you out. Do you know why I know that? It's because he didn't leave his own son in the pit. Interesting verse, Psalm 16, verse 10. Jesus is talking, and it says, you will not abandon me to the realm of the dead. That's a reference to Sheol, the pit. And when I read that, this is what I thought. Jesus went to the pit to deliver us out of every pit. Whether we get thrown into the pit, whether we even dig the pit for ourselves, he came to deliver us out of every pit and restore us to a relationship with the Father. Pits are tough. I will always remember where I was on the Saturday morning when I realized I was in a pit and the enemy was telling me, you'll never get out. And I came as close as you could possibly come of saying, this is it. And I remember I woke up on a Saturday morning in that apartment by myself, and I reached over and picked up my Bible that I had probably not picked up in weeks. And I just opened it to a story in the life of David. And it was a story where Absalom had run him off the throne. and he was going to take the ark. Remember the ark? Whoever had God wins. David said, get the ark. But as he was leaving, he said, send it back. I'm not going to manipulate the situation. God's in control. If he wants to restore me, he'll restore me. If he doesn't restore me, he won't restore me. But I'm not going to turn my back on God. And I got up that morning and I went to a Bible study that I had been invited to with a group of guys. I knew the guy that invited me. And I turned my face back to God. And it was amazing how God brought me up out of the pit. Now, you may be sitting here today. You may be in a financial situation, a financial pit. It's not even your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. Maybe you just got involved with someone who was not very honest, and just because you happen to be a business partner, you found yourself in that pit. But you know what? It may be in that pit that God is going to teach you something and show you something that's going to change your life forever. Maybe you're in a relational pit. Maybe you're in an emotional pit. Maybe you're struggling with discouragement or some kind of depression. Whatever it is, this is when you cry out to God and say, God, give me your perspective on why I'm in the pit. And then second, remember that your purpose is to turn to him and say, I ain't getting out without you. Next week, we're going to talk about prosperity. And I think it's interesting. There's been so much negative response to prosperity gospel. Most of us don't even like the word prosperity. I think the word prosper and prosperity is used in the Old Testament 63 times. And how many times that God says he wants to prosper us and he wants to bless us. Next week, I'm going to talk about the 4 keys of being blessed and living a prosperous life. Not necessarily financially, although it may involve that, but I mean in everything that you do. And we're going to see it in the life of Joseph next week when he finally moves into the palace. So that's what we'll be talking about.